After 5 years together, my fiancé suddenly confessed he wasn't sure he wanted to marry me. Then, in front of his friends, he even joked, "If you were prettier, I'd be more excited to marry you." This morning, his mother called me in tears. Brandon and I have been together just over 5 years, engaged for the last 8 months. We met through mutual friends at a housewarming party, bonding over a shared hatred of pineapple on pizza and a love of 90s cartoons. Our relationship progressed at a comfortable pace. We dated for a year, moved in together after 2, adopted our cat Biscuit in year 3, and got engaged last summer. The proposal wasn't extravagant, just a hike to our favourite lookout point where he fumbled with the ring box. I said yes immediately. We set our wedding for this October, and I've been slowly planning everything, mostly me planning and him just nodding along. About 3 months ago, he started making odd comments whenever we talked about the wedding. Nothing outright negative, just a hint of hesitation. If I showed him a potential venue, he'd say, "That's a lot of money for one day," or, "Do we really need to invite all those people?" I brushed it off as typical budget worries or pre-wedding nerves. Then he began lagging in, replying to wedding-related texts. He'd respond hours later with, "Looks fine," or "Whatever you want." When I asked if he was okay, he insisted he was just busy at work. His construction company had a big project, which seemed plausible. Last month, he started hanging out much more with his work friend Jake. They'd grab dinner after work or watch games at Jake's place, way more often than before. When Brandon came home from those hangouts, he was distant, glued to his phone and less affectionate. I confided in my best friend Leah, and she suspected it might just be pre-wedding jitters. She encouraged me to plan a special date night for us to reconnect. So, last Friday, I made a reservation at a new Italian restaurant downtown. I even put on a dress I hadn't worn in ages and stocked the fridge with his favourite dessert for later. I hoped a nice evening together would help. It didn't. The date was a disaster. Brandon seemed distracted the whole time, barely engaging in conversation. When I gently brought up finalising our honeymoon plans, he dropped the bomb. He said he wasn't sure if he was ready for any of this. The wedding, marriage, everything. I was stunned. 5 years together, 8 months engaged, and now he wasn't sure? I fought not to cry in the restaurant as he rambled that marriage changes things, citing Jake's jokes and his brother's messy divorce. Our conversation got heated, though I was hanging on to my composure by a thread. We hardly touched our dinner. The drive home was silent and tense. Back at our apartment, he refused to talk more. He said he needed time to think and ended up sleeping on the couch. Saturday morning was painfully awkward. We moved around like strangers sharing an Airbnb. He mentioned meeting up with Jake and some other friends for lunch to watch a game at the Rusty Nail, a sports bar downtown. I was too emotionally exhausted to argue and just let him go. A few hours later, Leah called and insisted on taking me out for a bit. We grabbed coffee and I poured out everything that had happened. She listened and suggested that maybe this was just normal pre-wedding anxiety on his part. After coffee, we wandered around Target, my go-to stress relief. I bought a couple of throw pillows and some shampoo, because retail therapy is still therapy, right? By that evening, I felt a little calmer and decided to head home. As I pulled into our apartment parking lot, I got a text from Kevin, one of Brandon's co-workers. I'd met him briefly at a company party. He asked if I was okay and mentioned that things got weird at the Rusty Nail. My heart sank. I called him immediately. Kevin was hesitant at first, but I begged him to tell me what happened. He finally explained that the guys had been teasing Brandon about the wedding. When Jake asked if he was really ready to settle down with one woman forever, Brandon, apparently not in his right mind, admitted he had doubts. Jake pressed what was holding him back, and that's when Brandon said, "If she were prettier, I'd be more excited about marrying her," then laughed like it was just a joke. Kevin said he and a couple of the others immediately told Brandon that was way out of line, but Brandon got defensive and claimed they were overreacting. I sat in my car and cried for a solid 20 minutes after hearing that. The man I love, who I thought loved me, basically joked that my looks were the reason he was hesitant to marry me, and he said it to his friends, like it was nothing. When I finally went inside, Brandon was passed out on the couch in the clothes he'd worn out. The apartment smelled like a bar. I scooped up Biscuit, went into the bedroom, and locked the door behind me. I had no desire to see or talk to him at that point. On Sunday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon, Brandon's typical "I'm sorry" breakfast. He looked miserable and sheepish, clearly hoping a nice breakfast would smooth things over. It didn't. I came out and immediately confronted him about what Kevin had told me. His face fell, and he started apologising over and over. He said he'd been an idiot and didn't mean a word of it. According to him, the guys were giving him crap about being tied down, and he blurted out something dumb to shut them up. He tried to excuse it as just a drunken joke, guys being guys, which only made me angrier. We ended up having the biggest fight of our entire relationship. I yelled, I cried, and I asked him how he could humiliate me like that. He kept saying he was sorry, that he was stressed about the wedding costs and everything and let it build up, but that didn't erase the hurt. I told him I needed time away from him and left. I went to stay at my brother Eric's place, which is my safe haven. Eric was furious on my behalf and wanted to confront Brandon, but I talked him down. I just needed space, not more drama. All day, Sunday, Brandon's texts kept coming, long apologies begging me to come home. I answered only once, saying I needed time to think. By Monday morning, I was still a mess. I called in sick to work because I couldn't pretend to be okay. Around 9 a.m, I got a call from Brandon's mum, Vanessa. She sounded upset and said Brandon had called her the night before. She told me there's something I need to know and asked to meet me as soon as possible. So now I'm sitting in my car outside a coffee shop, waiting to meet Vanessa shortly. I'm terrified of what I might learn, but I have to know. I keep twisting my engagement ring, wondering if I somehow missed the signs or if things really did fall apart this quickly. What could she possibly tell me that would make any of this okay? I didn't end up meeting Vanessa that morning after all. I ended up sitting in my car for a long while and I just couldn't face her yet. Instead, I drove back to my brother Eric's house and holed up in his tiny spare room, basically a storage closet with a futon. I spent the next few hours oscillating between crying and stress eating the emergency Oreos I found in Eric's pantry, trying to make sense of everything. Around noon, my best friend Leah popped by on her lunch break, armed with sandwiches from a deli near the hospital where she works. I hadn't eaten anything since the night before, unless you count Oreos as breakfast, and I guess she figured I'd need real food. Leah's always been the practical type. As we sat on the floor of Eric's cramped spare room eating, she gently reminded me that I couldn't avoid Brandon forever. We live together, share a life, and a lease, and sooner or later I'd have to talk to him about all this. She was right, of course. I couldn't camp out at my brother's place indefinitely, especially since Eric's girlfriend was coming over that evening, and I really didn't want to be the pathetic third wheel at their Taco Tuesday dinner. After Leah left, I took a long shower and borrowed one of Eric's hoodies. No shame, it was soft and comforting. I knew what I needed to do. I needed to confront Brandon and get some answers. I rehearsed in my head what I wanted to say the whole drive back to our apartment. I wouldn't yell, I wouldn't cry, I'd be calm and collected. I just wanted the truth. When I pulled into our parking spot, I noticed Brandon's truck was there. He should have been at work, so my stomach instantly knotted. I braced myself and walked up the stairs to our second floor unit. Inside, I found him on the couch in sweats, looking like he hadn't slept at all. He was surrounded by the wedding planning binders and notes that I'd compiled over the last 8 months. Our cat Biscuit was curled up next to him. Little traitor. Brandon looked up, surprised and then relieved to see me. He explained that he'd taken personal time off from work. He'd been sitting here, rifling through all our wedding plans, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. I didn't sit down. I stayed standing by the front door, arms crossed. I told him bluntly that flipping through venue brochures wasn't going to fix what he said or did. What followed was a long, emotional, and honestly exhausting conversation. First, he apologised again for what happened at the bar. He said his "if you were prettier" comment was inexcusable, and that he didn't even truly believe it. He claimed he just blurted out the most shocking thing he could think of in that moment. I asked him why would you ever say something so awful, especially if you didn't mean it. He said it was because he felt cornered by his friends and wanted to seem cool, like he wasn't completely whipped. That admission only made me angrier. I reminded him that it wasn't just the bar incident. He'd also expressed doubts about us at dinner before he ever went out with his friends that night. He was sober then, and he still said he wasn't sure about getting married. So what was his excuse for that? Brandon took a deep breath and told me that a lot of things had been eating at him. A project at work falling behind schedule, Paul's constant horror stories about marriage, anxiety about how much the wedding was costing. Basically, everything was piling up. And instead of talking to me about any of it, he bottled it up until it exploded in the worst possible way. As we talked, a new layer of his feelings started to surface. Brandon confessed something I never expected. He's terrified of turning into his father. I knew that his dad walked out on his family when Brandon was 12, left his mom, Vanessa, and moved to Arizona to start a new family with a co-worker he'd been having an affair with. Brandon has rarely talked about it, always insisting it didn't affect him much. But now he admitted that he's been haunted by the fear that he might have some genetic predisposition to cheat or bail on his family, just like his dad did. He said that the closer our wedding got, the more this fear gnawed at him. He started questioning whether he could truly promise someone forever, when, in his experience, forever didn't work out for his parents. I was stunned. I gently reminded him that he is not his father, and that biology isn't destiny. Just because his dad made those choices doesn't mean he will. But Brandon was clearly spiralling with these doubts. He said something like, "How do I know I won't just end up unhappy and make you unhappy? What if I turn out just like him?" I asked if he'd talked to anyone about these fears. He hesitated and then admitted that he'd confided in Kevin, the same co-worker who had called me about the bar incident. Apparently, Kevin and he had gotten closer over the past few months, and Kevin had been through some relationship issues of his own, So Brandon felt like he could open up to him. That clicked for me. So that's why Kevin was the one to reach out to me about the bar. He already knew Brandon was having doubts and was concerned. I kept pressing, trying to understand exactly what Brandon had been feeling and thinking. Finally, he laid it out. He was scared and overwhelmed by the idea of marriage, despite loving me. He said he'd look at me and want all the things we'd planned, but then he'd hear his dad's voice in the back of his head, or Paul's jokes about losing his freedom, and he'd start to panic. He told me he would think about how his parents seemed happy until suddenly they weren't, and he was terrified of us following that same path. I asked him why on earth he didn't just talk to me about all of this when these feelings started. He shook his head and said he was afraid that if he told me he was having doubts or fears, I think he didn't love me enough. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. By hiding his fears, he ended up hurting me far more than if he'd just been honest. There was a pause, and then I had to ask the question that had been weighing on me since this all began. Were his doubts about marriage in general, or about marrying me specifically? The moment the question hung in the air, I saw tears well up in his eyes. He looked down and took a long time to answer. Finally, in a broken voice, he said, "It's mostly me being afraid of marriage, but part of me wondered if maybe we've changed too much, if we're really right for each other long term." That admission hit me like a truck. I actually felt my heart break a little more, if that's even possible. 5 years together, and he was still questioning whether I was the right person for him. I asked him, choking back tears, what had changed so much that he would suddenly doubt us? He mentioned that we're not the same people we were in our early 20s. He said I used to be more spontaneous and carefree, and now I'm, his words, obsessed with planning and organising everything. For the record, I don't think that's a bad thing. We're adults with jobs and responsibilities. Of course I plan more. He also admitted that he had dreams of starting his own business that he's since put aside, and he partly blames me for that, saying he chose a stable job because he felt he needed to be responsible for our future rather than risk a startup. According to him, he wasn't sure if we had grown together or just grown apart while trying to build a life. By this point, I was emotionally drained beyond words. I felt like every hope I had for our future was being methodically dismantled in front of me. I told Brandon I needed time away from him to process everything, the public humiliation, the secret doubts, and now this uncertainty about our compatibility. He begged me not to go and urged us to work through it together. He even offered to start therapy or couples counselling immediately. But I just couldn't. Not right then. I needed space. I went into the bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and started throwing some clothes and toiletries into it. He hovered in the doorway, crying, asking me not to leave. I was crying too, but I was resolute. I told him I'd come back for the rest of my things later, but I had to get out of there for now. As I was zipping up my suitcase, he mentioned that my phone had been buzzing non-stop. I looked over and saw 3 missed calls from his mum, Vanessa. In all the chaos, I had completely forgotten I was supposed to meet her. I glanced at the clock. It was well past the time I'd promised to be at the cafe. No wonder she'd been calling. I muttered, "Oh God, I blew off your mum." At that, Brandon's face went from distraught to downright anxious. "What did my mum want to talk to you about?" he asked quietly. I replied that I didn't know, just that she called me crying, saying she had something important to tell me after their conversation last night. He closed his eyes like he was in pain. I could see the guilt all over him. I demanded, "Brandon, what's going on? What does your mum know that I don't?" He wouldn't answer directly, just kept saying, "It's not my place. Please, you should talk to her." I pressed harder, but he just kept shaking his head and saying I should hear it from her. I realised whatever this was, he didn't have the courage to tell me himself, which made my heart sink even further. I stepped away and called Vanessa back. She answered on the first ring, sounding both relieved and worried. I apologised for not showing up earlier and told her I was coming now. I didn't give details, and she didn't ask. She just urged me to hurry, saying, "It's important, you know. I'll explain everything when you get here." Her tone made my skin crawl. We agreed to meet in half an hour. Before I left, I turned to Brandon one last time. He looked so small and broken in that moment. "Is there something you need to tell me, Brandon?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me with red, swollen eyes and said, "There's so much I want to say, but I love you. I'm so sorry." I just nodded. "Sometimes love isn't enough," I replied softly, and then I left. I threw my suitcase in the car and drove off, tears streaming down my face. On the way to the coffee shop, my phone rang again. It was Brandon's sister, Sabrina. I wiped my eyes and picked up, trying to keep my voice steady. Sabrina sounded concerned as she asked what was happening between me and her brother. Apparently, she'd heard through the grapevine, likely from Paul or someone at the bar, that things were bad, and she knew their mum was upset too. I told her that I was on my way to meet their mum, and that I didn't have the full story yet. Sabrina asked, "Is it about Nina?" Hearing that name made my heart drop into my stomach. Nina is a project coordinator at Brandon's company, a name I'd heard in passing a couple of times. What about Nina? I asked carefully. Sabrina immediately realised she'd slipped up. She got flustered and just said, I think I should let Mum explain. I'm so sorry. Please hear her out, okay? I tried to get more out of her, but she wouldn't say anything beyond telling me she loved me and that she'd be there for me no matter what. By the time I got to the coffee shop, I was shaking. Through the window, I could see Vanessa sitting at a corner booth, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She looked as upset as I felt. As I walked toward the door, my phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Whatever Mum tells you, please remember, I love you and I'm sorry. I understand if you hate me. I had no reply to that. I put my phone away, took a deep breath and went inside. I slid into the seat across from Vanessa, my heart pounding. Hi, I said softly. I'm here, please. Just tell me what's going on. I met with Vanessa that afternoon, and the conversation that followed turned my world upside down all over again. The coffee shop was busy with college kids and shoppers, but we managed to find a quiet corner. I could tell Vanessa had been crying. Her eyes were red, and she wasn't wearing her usual makeup. In the 5 years I've known her, I'd never seen her without lipstick and mascara. I was trembling as I sat down. After some excruciating small talk, I urged her to just tell me. She took a deep breath and said, Brandon called me last night in a complete meltdown. Yes, he has fears about commitment and turning into his father, but there's something else, something more immediate. She fixed her gaze on me and whispered, It's about Nina. I almost choked on my coffee. Nina, the new project coordinator at Brandon's company, the woman Sabrina had accidentally mentioned. My voice barely came out as I asked, What about Nina? Gently, haltingly, Vanessa explained that over the past few months, Brandon had developed feelings for Nina. According to what he told his mother, nothing physical happened, but he'd formed an emotional attachment that made him question everything about our relationship. I felt like the cafe was tilting. I tried to connect the dots. Nina started at his company around New Year's. I met her briefly at a company party in March. By then, Brandon was already acting more distant, checking his phone constantly, spending more time with work friends. All the signs I'd attributed to big project stress suddenly took on a new meaning. Through tears, I asked why she was telling me this instead of protecting her son. Vanessa's eyes welled up again. She told me that years ago, before Brandon's father left, she went through months of hell. Her husband grew distant, picked fights, even made hurtful comments, all because he didn't have the courage to admit he was involved with someone else. She didn't want to see me kept in the dark and strung along the way she had been. I couldn't let you marry him without knowing the full truth, she said softly. Hearing this made Brandon's cruel joke at the bar click into place. It wasn't just stupid, drunken bluster. It was, in a twisted way, a subconscious attempt to sabotage our relationship. He was too cowardly to break things off or confess his feelings for Nina, so he behaved in ways, perhaps even unknowingly, to make me question the relationship or hate him, so he wouldn't have to be the bad guy making the hard choice. We ended up talking for over an hour. Vanessa shared more about her own marriage's end, how she tried to keep it together even after discovering the affair, how she blamed herself for a long time. She squeezed my hand and said something I'll never forget. The hardest lesson I learned was that you can't make someone choose you. They either do or they don't, and anything in between is just delaying the inevitable. By the time I left the cafe, I felt numb. I sat in my car for a while staring at nothing, trying to process what I'd learned. There were a few new texts from Brandon. More apologies, more I love you messages. Still not a single mention of Nina. I didn't reply. Instead, I called Leah and asked in a surprisingly calm voice if I could crash at her place for a while. Of course, she said yes immediately. Before leaving the parking lot, I did one thing. I texted Brandon, I know about Nina. Don't contact me again until you're ready to be completely honest. I'll be by tomorrow for more of my things. Then, I blocked his number, at least for the night. I needed some peace. On the drive to Leah's, Sabrina called again. The conversation that followed confirmed everything Vanessa had said, plus added another layer of betrayal. Sabrina had overheard Brandon and Jake talking about the situation a few days prior. She had confronted her brother and forced him to promise he'd come clean to me after the weekend. Clearly, he hadn't. Sabrina was livid on my behalf. Despite being his sister, she made it clear she supported me fully. You're family to me too, she insisted, her voice fierce. I broke down crying, telling her how much that meant. I realised I was mourning not just the loss of Brandon, but potentially the loss of the family I'd grown to love. Sabrina's unwavering support felt like a lifeline. Leah's apartment was exactly the refuge I needed. She immediately set up the pull-out couch in her living room and ordered Thai food for us. We ate on the floor, watching some baking show on TV without really paying attention. The normalcy of that evening, pad thai on paper plates, her cat Milo curling up in my lap as I mindlessly pet him, was oddly healing. After Leah went to bed, I stayed up scrolling through photos on my phone. 5 years of memories with Brandon were in there, Goofy selfies on lazy Sundays, vacation snapshots, videos of us decorating the Christmas tree. I thought I might cry again, but I didn't. I felt strangely calm, like I was in the eye of the storm. As I was finally drifting off to an uneasy sleep, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from an unknown number. Megan, this is Nina. I know you blocked Brandon. Can we meet tomorrow? There's more to the story that you should know. Just the two of us. I must have read that message a dozen times, heart pounding. More to the story? What else could there be? It took me nearly an hour of staring at the ceiling, my mind racing, before I replied. Where and when is all I wrote. The next morning, as promised, I met Nina in person. We chose a small breakfast cafe near a park, neutral territory. I arrived first and was nervously stirring a cup of tea when she walked in. To my surprise, Nina looked just as anxious as I felt. She wasn't the temptress I'd built up in my head. In fact, she looked rather ordinary and very nervous. Hair in a messy bun, minimal makeup, fidgeting with her phone until she spotted me. When she sat down, I could see her hands were shaking. If she'd been scheming to steal my fiancé, I imagined she'd be more confident. Instead, she looked uncomfortable and remorseful. I realised I wasn't the only one who had been put through the ringer. The conversation that followed was nothing like I expected. Nina took a deep breath and told me two major things. First, she had no idea Brandon had feelings for her until Paul, yes, that Paul, mentioned it offhand last week. She and Brandon had worked together on a project and occasionally texted after hours, but it was all work-related. She even showed me their text history, mostly work jokes and memes, nothing remotely flirty. She insisted she never encouraged anything beyond a professional friendship. In fact, she has a boyfriend of 3 years who sometimes joined their group at happy hours. I was astonished. All this time, I'd imagined this femme fatale seducing Brandon, but the reality was much more mundane. A friendly colleague oblivious to the storm brewing around her. The second revelation was about Paul's role. Apparently, Paul had been stoking Brandon's doubts at every opportunity. Nina overheard Paul egging Brandon on to enjoy freedom and explore other options before settling down. More disturbingly, he had used her name to do it, telling Brandon that Nina gets you better than your fiancé and that he'd regret not playing the field. She also confirmed that Paul had been going around the office announcing that Brandon was having cold feet. So, the toxic culture that had been driving Brandon's fears had a ringleader. Paul. By the end of our meeting, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Nina wasn't the villain of this story, just another person caught in the crossfire of Brandon's meltdown and Paul's manipulation. Before we parted, Nina looked at me with empathy and said, "You seem like someone who knows her worth. Don't let anyone make you question it." It's ironic. I got some of the most validating words of this entire saga from the person I thought I'd least want to hear from. I thanked her sincerely for meeting me, and we went our separate ways. Walking away from that cafe, I felt oddly calm. I had the full story now, and I knew what I needed to do. I texted Sabrina that I wanted to gather everyone, Brandon, his family, and Paul, for a face-to-face meeting. No more hearsay, no more half-truths. I wanted everything on the table once and for all. Sabrina agreed and offered her apartment as neutral ground. She made sure Paul would show up too. He wouldn't dare say no to her. That evening, we all assembled at Sabrina's place. The atmosphere was as heavy and awkward as you'd imagine. Sabrina had ordered some takeout pasta and salad, but nobody touched it. Vanessa was quietly tense. Paul looked defensive. And Brandon looked like he hadn't slept in about a week. For a long time, we just sat there, pushing food around and avoiding the elephant in the room. Finally, Vanessa, of all people, cut through the tension. She cleared her throat and said, "We're not here for small talk. Let's get this all out in the open." That opened the floodgates. I calmly, or as calmly as I could, shared what Nina had told me, especially about Paul's advice to Brandon. Paul turned beet red and started to bluster, but Sabrina shut him down with a glare that could melt steel. Brandon, to his credit, didn't defend Paul. In fact, he even admitted that he'd let himself be influenced by all the negative talk, and that he'd essentially built a fantasy around Nina as an escape from his fears. When I brought up the bar comment one last time, Brandon broke down. He looked at me and said, "It wasn't about how you look. I was being an idiot. I was drunk and trying to show off. I thought I was being funny, but I was just hurting you. I'm so sorry." Paul mumbled something about it being just a joke, but one sharp look from both Sabrina and Vanessa silenced him. Sabrina quietly reminded us all that the wedding was supposed to be in 3 months. The silence that followed was deafening. That's when I spoke the words that had been forming since the night I left our apartment. "It's not anymore." I told them that I could not, in good conscience, marry someone who had so many doubts and who had put me through what Brandon had. I said it kindly, but firmly. The wedding was off. Brandon didn't argue. How could he? He knew it was the right call too. We both sat there with tears in our eyes, accepting that our 5-year relationship had come to this sad end. It wasn't angry or dramatic, it was just devastatingly sad. Around midnight, we all finally went our separate ways. Sabrina insisted on driving me back to Leah's. In the car, she held my hand and told me this didn't change the fact that I was like a sister to her. I cried, again, but these tears were mixed with gratitude. Even in all this mess, I hadn't lost everything. I still had people who loved me. When I got back to Leah's that night, I felt empty, too emotionally drained to even think. I collapsed onto the pull-out couch and stared at the ceiling until dawn, mind blank. The next day was a whirlwind of practicalities, cancelling venues and vendors, informing guests, figuring out how to untangle two lives that had been intertwined for years. In the span of a few days, I went from choosing wedding invitations to cancelling contracts and writing apologetic messages to relatives about why the wedding was off. One of the harder moments was removing my engagement ring. I remember sliding it off and feeling this weight, like a chapter closing. I placed it back in its little box, unsure what I'd ultimately do with it. And then, life went on. Because that's what it does. It's been 3 months since that family dinner where my engagement effectively ended. 3 months of rebuilding my life in ways I never anticipated. I'm writing this from my new apartment, a place that, back then, I couldn't have imagined I'd be living in now. First, the practical stuff. Brandon moved out of our shared apartment within a week of us calling everything off. With the help of my brother and Leah, I packed up all of his belongings while he was at work. We labelled the boxes neatly and left them for him in the living room to collect. It was surreal, dividing up 5 years of shared life into his and mine. I remember packing the coffee maker he'd gotten for his birthday, the cosy throw blanket I'd bought on our weekend trip to that little mountain town, the framed photos we'd hung on almost every wall. Piece by piece, our home was dismantled. After he took his things, the apartment felt hollow, like a stage set after the play has ended. I managed to stay in that apartment for only 2 more weeks. Every corner of it reminded me of us, and I couldn't stand living in what felt like the ghost of our relationship. The lease manager, sympathetic to my situation, agreed to let me break the lease early in exchange for 1 extra month's rent. I paid it without hesitation. It was worth it to escape the place where every room held a memory. Finding a new place on my own turned out to be tougher than I expected. The rental market is brutal, and my budget is tighter now that I'm on my own. I eventually found a small 1-bedroom across town. It's further from work and not as modern as our last place, but it has a tiny balcony where I've started growing herbs in little pots. For the record, the basil is struggling, but the mint is thriving. Fitting, I suppose. Adjusting to supporting myself alone has been an eye-opener. I've become very acquainted with clipping coupons and buying store-brand everything. I track my expenses to the penny. But you know what? I'm kind of proud of myself. I'm doing it. The wedding fallout could have been a nightmare, but most vendors were surprisingly kind. The venue kept our deposit. Ouch. But the coordinator sent me a note wishing me happiness. The florist refunded half, even though she didn't have to. The photographer was able to fill our date with another event and returned our payment. Even our DJ, get this, referred me to his brother's counselling centre when he heard what happened, saying my well-being was more important than any balance owed. People can be wonderful. And what about the ring? Right now, it's sitting in its box in my dresser drawer. Brandon insisted I keep it. He said he felt too guilty accepting it back, like it would carry bad mojo. For now, I can't bear to sell it or do anything with it. It's a symbol of something that was very real to me, and I'm not ready to part with it yet. Social media was a beast I chose to confront on my own terms. After waiting a couple of weeks, I quietly changed my status and posted a simple message that we decided to part ways, and I appreciate everyone's understanding. Then, I logged off for a while. The curiosity from others was intense. My DMs were flooded with question marks and concerned check-ins, but I kept it private. When I was ready, I shared a photo of me holding the keys to my new apartment, with the caption, "New Beginnings." It felt like closing one door and opening another, quite literally. As for Brandon and me, we only spoke a handful of times after the dust settled, mostly to sort out practical things. Those conversations were polite, brief, and strictly business. It was strange and sad how two people who were once each other's whole world could be reduced to cordial exchanges about forwarding mail and splitting the remaining bills. According to Sabrina, Brandon has been focusing on work and, importantly, on himself. One surprising thing happened about a month ago. He reached out and asked if I'd meet him for coffee. I agreed, cautiously. It wasn't a ploy to win me back. Instead, he earnestly told me he's been in therapy, working through his issues. He even showed me a journal his therapist has him keeping, pages of reflections on his relationship with his dad, his tendency to give in to toxic influences like Paul, and the mistakes he made with me. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said he wanted me to know he was trying to become a better man. I found myself genuinely hoping he succeeds. Not for me, we're long over, but because I still care about the human being he is. He also told me he was glad I remained close with Sabrina and Vanessa. That made me smile and cry at the same time. Losing him was one thing. Losing them too would have been a second heartbreak. Thankfully, I didn't. I still talk to or see his mum and sister often. They have been beyond supportive, never pressuring me, never prying, just reminding me that I'm loved. Now, 3 months out, I'm learning to love life on my own. It hasn't been all epiphanies and grand adventures. Healing is quieter and more incremental than that. I've been seeing a therapist too, and she's helping me unpack the parts of myself I lost or dimmed during my relationship. I realised I had slowly morphed into someone who accommodated and compromised at every turn to keep the peace. In therapy, I'm learning to find my voice again, to set boundaries, and to prioritise myself without guilt. I've also rediscovered things that make me me. I started hiking on Saturday mornings again. The first time I reached the top of a trail and watched the sunrise by myself, I felt a rush of empowerment I hadn't felt in years. I've been painting and sketching again, a hobby I let slip over time. I even joined a weekly trivia night team with some co-workers, and it turns out I'm pretty good at it. Little by little, I'm filling my life with things that bring me joy. Am I ready to date again? Nope, not yet. And that's okay. My friends joke about setting me up, but I just smile and tell them I'm taking a break from romance for a while. I want to make sure that when I do dip my toes back in those waters, I'm entering as the person I want to be, not a shattered version of myself. I'm getting there, day by day. One of the most unexpectedly healing experiences came from what should have been the saddest. We had a honeymoon trip booked to a seaside cottage, non-refundable. Initially, the idea of going alone was unthinkable, but with some encouragement, Leah practically packed my suitcase for me. I went on that trip by myself. The first day was hard, I won't lie. I watched the sun set over the ocean and felt the weight of everything that could have been. But by day 3, I felt something shift. I woke up to the sound of waves and actually smiled. I spent my days exactly how I wanted, walking along the beach for hours, reading on the porch, cooking myself simple meals, and even chatting with some locals at the little cafe in town. In the evenings, I'd journal or just sit with my thoughts, and a glass of wine. I didn't realise how much I needed that solitude until I was in it. I returned from what was supposed to be my honeymoon feeling. Restored. It wasn't the honeymoon I planned, but it was the one I apparently needed. A couple of days ago, I had a moment that caught me off guard in the best way. I was at the grocery store after work, humming along to the music playing over the loudspeaker as I pushed my cart. Halfway through the cereal aisle, I realised the song that was playing was our song, the one that used to reduce me to tears whenever I heard it. And there I was, humming along, heart steady. I even smiled. It felt like a tiny triumph, proof that the wounds are healing. So here I am, in my little one-bedroom apartment, with Biscuit purring on my lap as I finish writing this story. The wedding is off. That chapter of my life is closed. But I'm still here. I survived the hurt, and I'm finding me again. Life is a lot more uncertain than it was a few months ago. I'm not entirely sure what the future holds. And for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty doesn't scare me. It excites me. I've learned that endings are rarely neat or easy, but they often lead to new beginnings you never imagined. The picture I had of my future, married to Brandon, settling into comfortable domesticity, has been replaced with a blank canvas. And you know what? I'm hopeful about it. I get to paint that canvas however I want now. Whatever comes next, new love, new challenges, new adventures, I know I'll be okay. I'm finding strength I didn't know I had, and I'm carrying forward the lessons of this heartbreak. To trust my instincts, to communicate openly, and to never, ever settle for less than the respect and love I deserve. My story didn't end where I thought it would, but I'm finally looking forward to turning the page and seeing what the next chapter holds.